guys, to another episode of Dimitra's Dishes. Today we're making Tsoureki. Tsoureki is the Greek Easter sweetbread that is just so light and aromatic and delicious, perfect with a cup of coffee. Now, every year I get pictures from you guys of the tsoureki that you make at home. They always look beautiful, and you let me know that they're the most delicious tsoureki that you guys have ever made. But I also get a few common questions and problems that you guys come across. So we're gonna go over those in this video. And if I don't go over one that you've had in the past, post it in the comment section down below and I'll respond to it as soon as I can. Let's get started. So I'm using my stand mixer. I'm gonna attach the dough hook in a few seconds. We always begin by proofing the yeast. So we're gonna add the milk. So in the original recipe, I use only a half cup of the milk and then I add the 3/4 of a cup afterwards, but I found that adding all the milk at once works perfectly fine. You wanna make sure that the milk is slightly warm, a little bit warm. It's kind of like lukewarm water. That's what it should feel like. And then I have 2 tablespoons of all-purpose flour and a couple teaspoons of granulated sugar. That's gonna help feed the yeast so that we can make sure that it is alive. If your yeast is not good, the tsoureki will not rise. So this is a tablespoon of active dry yeast. One question was if you guys can use fresh yeast, and that usually comes in like little cubes. Yes, you can. You're just going to need about 4 times the amount. And I do have the gram measurements on the blog post that's going to be linked to this recipe. Now we're just going to give this a little whisk. I'll use this knife over here. And I'm going to set it aside for about 10 minutes just to make sure that the yeast is going to start getting activated. You know it's active when a foamy cloud forms on the top. And I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. While that's happening, we're going to measure the dry ingredients. So it's important to have a kitchen scale because even though I do use cup and cup measurements, gram measurements are always very accurate. So I'm using 4.5 cups of bread flour. Now, this is not sponsored. This is just my local supermarket's brand, organic bread flour, but I have made this with different companies' bread flour and they always come out the same exact way. So 4.5 cups, which is 720 grams. And I'll measure it right in front of you so that way you see how I even measure it. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're at 648 grams. So the half cup should take it to 720. We're at 712, so I'll put a little more. There we go, 720 grams. Now you can use all-purpose flour if that's all you have. That works perfectly. Last year, during the pandemic, it was impossible to find bread flour. So I did test the recipe using all-purpose flour, and it works perfectly. I'll go over that step later. Then we need a little pinch of salt, about 1/4 teaspoon or so. That seems right. And you could do the zest of an orange or the zest of clementines. And then we're going to add a cup of granulated sugar. Now, the 2 most important ingredients are mastica, also known as mastic gum. You only need 1/4 teaspoon of this, and it needs to be very finely ground. And I'm going to show you how we grind it in just a second. There are these crystals that have such a nice aroma. People in Greece chew this as gum because it is a resin. It has a little bit of a pine flavor to it. And then mahlepi. These are the mahlepi seeds, which is the best way to get them so that way they're really fresh. In Middle Eastern stores, you can find them as mahleb. And basically, they're the pits of the cherry seed. And these also need to be ground up. So we're going to grind these right now. So you can use a high-speed blender or a coffee grinder. We're going to need 1 heaping tablespoon, but if you're making a bunch, you could grind them all at once and keep them refrigerated. So I'm putting the mahlepi seeds in this little grinder. And I'm just going to pulse them until they're finely ground. And this is what it looks like when they're done. You can have some coarse pieces and some fine pieces. I like the coarser pieces better, so don't turn it into a powder. So the thing about mastica is it does turn into a gum once you blend it too much. So I have about a teaspoon of granulated sugar in there, and I'll put about a teaspoon of mastica granules in there. And I'm just gonna turn this into a powder. And you can also do this instead of in a food processor or in a mixer. You can do it using a mortar and pestle. That's also an option. So now I'm going to add the mahlepi. I want a heaping tablespoonful, because this is where most of the characteristic flavor comes from. And mastica, you don't want to add too much. A quarter teaspoon is just the right amount, because if you add too much, it might get a little overpowering and bitter. And I do list other flavor options on the blog post, so you can check that out. Then I'm just going to whisk everything all together. And the yeast is activated. Let me show you what it's supposed to look like. So the yeast is activated. Now we're going to add all of the dry ingredients to the mixing bowl. You can add them in all at once. And then we need 2 eggs. Make sure that they're at room temperature. If you forgot to take them out in the morning, you can put them in a bowl of warm water and just switch the warm water out a few times until the eggs reach room temperature. You want everything to be room temperature so that way the dough rises quickly. And then to the eggs, I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. I always go a little heavier with the vanilla. And just whisk it together lightly. And add the eggs and vanilla to the mixer. And now we're going to let this knead for 10 minutes. Once the 10 minutes are up, I'm going to add the butter. I have unsalted butter. This is 2 ounces of unsalted butter. And then I'm going to let that knead about 2 more minutes after the butter is added. If you're using all-purpose flour, then knead it for 12 minutes and then add the butter and knead it for 2 minutes more. You have to knead all-purpose flour a little bit more than the bread flour, so that way the tsoureki doesn't crumble and it stays just nice and stringy and soft in the way good tsoureki is supposed to be. So the dough is still going to be sticky, but it's going to have some strength to it. It's not just going to drop and fall off the dough hook. It's going to be sticky still, so make sure you don't add any more flour. Resist the urge to add more flour. Now, even though I gave the gram measurement, which is 720 grams of either all-purpose or bread flour, for some reason, depending on your altitude, the humidity, all these things, it varies. And I have made this in New York in my sister's house. The measurement was still the same, but sometimes you guys tell me that it was too wet or whatever. A lot of times you feel the need to add flour to combat the stickiness of the dough, but you want the dough to be sticky so it can be nice and light instead of dry. The second it hits the oil in the bowl, the stickiness is going to go away. So you want to have a bowl that's big enough to hold double the volume of the dough, and add about 2 to 3 tablespoons of olive oil or vegetable oil. Then go ahead and transfer the dough to the oiled bowl. And if you have one of these dough scrapers, it's going to make life really easy. I'll put the link down below where you can get one. You see how sticky it is? Now watch, when we toss it in the oil, the stickiness completely goes away. It's still really nice and soft, which is the way it should be, but it's no longer sticky. Cover it with plastic wrap or with a clean kitchen towel. Now the most important part is you have to set this aside so it can double in volume. This can take up to 4 hours if it's cold in your house, maybe even a little bit more, but it can be done in as little as 2 or 2.5 hours if you put it in a really nice warm place. Now there's a trick that I use called the dryer trick, and that is also in the description. It's going to be in the blog post. It does save you about 30 minutes if you use it. You might have to run the dryer twice, taking the bowl out. Check the blog post out for that. set it aside. It has to double in volume. Otherwise, you're going to have problems with it spreading and just not baking right in the oven. Do not rush this part. There's also a method known as the cold rise method. What you would do is you would take this bowl just the way it is and put it in the refrigerator for 24 hours and let it rise slowly in the cold temperature. That is an option if you want to bake it fresh on the day that you're going to be serving it. Then you would just take it out of the fridge, form it into a braid or whatever shape you're forming it in. Let it get puffy for about 40-45 minutes or an hour. It's going to take a little longer if it's cold. And then you just bake it off. They say using the cold rise method, more flavor develops. I'm not a huge fan of it because I don't like really working with cold dough, but I did test it and it does work perfectly. Let it rise until it's doubled in volume, then we're going to shape it. The dough has risen. This is what it should look like. It should be nice and fluffy and soft. I'm going to transfer it to my work surface and I'm going to cut it into 2 portions. Now you can make these big like the way I'm going to make them today, the traditional size. This makes 2 beautiful big braids. Each portion, if you're making the big braids, should be cut into 3 equal pieces. These aren't really equal, but they will do. And I do have a video on how to make stuffed tsoureki, and I've stuffed them with Nutella, cream cheese, and almond paste. There are so many ways to do it, and I made little mini ones. I'll put the link down below where you can do that. And now we're going to roll each strand, each portion into a long rope, so that way we can braid them together. And if the dough rose properly, it's going to be very easy to work with. It's not going to shrink on you as you're rolling it out. It's going to be nice and soft. You're not going to need any extra flour. If it's still a little bit on the sticky side, you can grease your work surface with a little tiny bit of oil and your hands as well. Okay, so now we're just going to braid it, just the way you would braid hair. And of course, you could stuff each one of these strands with your favorite fillings, but I'm keeping it very classic and plain because there's so much flavor. So put it on a baking tray that's lined with parchment paper. So we're just going to braid it one more time. And then the top portion, you can do the same thing. And then place that on the parchment paper. Stay there. Then you want to loosely cover it with the same piece of plastic that it was covered with before. You want to preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to put this on top of the stove top while the oven is warming up. And now it's going to take about 30 or 40 minutes for this to puff up a little bit. You don't want this to double in size because then it's going to flatten while it's baking. I'll show you what it looks like as soon as it's there. Now, if you wanted to bake eggs into this to give it that Easter festive touch, then I don't like to bake the dyed eggs into the braid because a lot of times the color seeps through and it stains the bread. What you can do, like I mentioned in the blog post, is fold or crumble up some balls of either parchment paper or aluminum foil is even better, and then stick them in between wherever the eggs are going to be. Yeah, wherever you want to put the eggs, and that way the bread will bake with a little bit of a hole in it, so that way once it's baked, then you can put the eggs in there and it'll look as if they were baked in there, if that makes sense. But all of those step-by-step instructions are going to be on the blog post. I'm going to set this aside and preheat my oven, and then we're going to move on to the next step. So the tsoureki were rising for 40 minutes, and you know they're ready when they've puffed up a little bit, and it holds your finger indentation. See that? If you poke them, first of all, if they rose more than this and you poke them and they start to deflate, that means that they rose too much and they might spread when they're baking. So then, sorry to say that you're going to have to cut them again and roll them out one more time and braid them. So I have 2 egg yolks over here, and I'm just going to break up a little bit with the pastry brush. And I'm going to add a few tablespoons of whole milk. You could do heavy cream if you want. The heavy cream will make them a deeper golden color. And just brush the tsoureki with the egg wash. Now I put them both on one tray, but you can definitely bake them on separate trays if you prefer. They are going to puff up a little bit more than this. Now you can leave them just like this. You could sprinkle the top with some sesame seeds or with some almond slivers. I'll leave one plain and one with almonds. So these are going to bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit on the center rack for about 35 to 40 minutes. As soon as they're beautifully golden, like a mahogany color on top, you're going to take them out and you're going to let them sit at room temperature for at least 20 minutes before you cut into them. I'll show you what they look like as soon as they're done. Now, while that happens, I just did want to say that I put the ground up mahlepi and the ground up mastica in 2 little containers, and I'm gonna store them in the refrigerator because that's where they're gonna keep freshest. I'm gonna store the mahlepi seeds in my pantry, and then I'll grind them whenever I need more. So the tsoureki are ready. They took 35 minutes in my oven to bake. Like I said, look for the color, and they should still be nice and soft, so don't overbake them. Then let them sit at room temperature for at least 30 minutes, so that way they'll still be warm, but all of the moisture will settle. And it is time to take a bite. But before I do that, just look at how soft they are when you squeeze them. They should be really nice and soft, even though they're perfectly golden all around. And when you pull them apart, instead of crumbling like a cake, they should have a little bit of a stretch to them, a little bit of a pull, and almost like layers of stringy layers. That's how you know that the tsoureki was kneaded well, it rose perfectly, and then it was baked good, so it should be nice and moist. I'm making myself a cup of Greek coffee. Layla's going to do the taste test. How is it?
Good.
Is it soft?
Yeah.
It's soft, it's crunchy, it smells amazing in the house. I hope you guys give this recipe a try. All the exact measurements are in the description box down below and on the website, www.dimitrasdishes.com. Get some butter and jam out to serve this with. You could also top it with chocolate. The ultimate tsoureki checklist and guide is also on the blog, so I'll make sure I'll post that down below. And let me know again if you guys have any comments or questions. I'm losing my train of thought because Layla, is it that good? She keeps saying, Anyway, I'll be back here with another recipe. Thank you guys so much. Yes, us.